6th of the European Universities Debating Championship. Speeches obviously will be 7 minutes in length, and the standing orders for the debate will remain the same as they have done for the previous 5 preliminary rounds. To formally introduce this debate, I'm going to just quickly ask the panel to introduce themselves with their preferred pronouns.
My name is Mike.
My name is Fred, I'm the chair of this round, and I don't mind whatever you want to call me.
I'm Elma, I prefer she.
Who's he?
Okay, and could I please get who's speaking first from the opening government team?
Andrew P.
Ollie, I don't mind.
From the opening opposition team?
Sarah Whitford, and she.
James and who?
Could I get from the closing government?
Leonard P. Awesome.
And from the closing opposition team?
Dan E.
And Karen she.
Thank you. I'd like to thank all speakers for that. And now, without any further ado, I'd like to call on Prime Minister Andrew to open the case that stands in his name from the opening government team, ABERYSTWYTH.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we think there's a problem in current political systems in that we think personality politics is massively more important than the actual policies. We think people get caught up in this kind of drama of politics and don't actually understand the real issues. We think there's huge social pressures to vote in a certain way in certain areas. We think there's a lack of accountability. We think all of these problems can be solved at the point at which we introduce a blind voting system. First, I'm going to explain to you the exact mech we're going to use, and then we're going to go into 2 major points. About first, how we create a better democracy for the voter, and then about how we create improvement within political parties to be more effective at governing, etc. So first, our mech. So our mech is going to go something like this. So as we said, it's blind voting. We're going to presume this is set in some kind of constituent parliament because that just makes sense to us. But I mean, so what we think the plan would be something like is when you go to vote, you get a booklet, and on each page it will have say 8 or 9 major issues such as healthcare, such as immigration, the EU, foreign policy. And below that, there will be however many parties, and each one of them will have written down what their policies are in a reasonably concise fashion, but obviously that will not be marked as to which party that is. At which point you say, you know what, I like the policy A about healthcare, I will tick that, that is my vote. At the end of that, after someone has looked at your ballot, they will then say, so this person ticked A most of the time, that means that like 56% of the time they prefer the Social Democratic Party, that person's vote therefore goes towards the Social Democrats. After the election, they can then find out, if they choose, who they voted for, and obviously they'll know who won because that's the point of the election. We also think it's okay if people only want to vote on a single issue. We're prepared to take that, we realize that gives because we think it's okay if people want to vote on a single issue. We think there's a major democratic right to vote if healthcare is the main issue in your constituency. We think that's fine. Generally, we think that whatever problems that causes is okay because single-issue voters are still important, they still matter, they still have a voice. Okay, so I'm going to tell you first about why this creates a better democracy. So first, yes?
How do you plan to weight the preferences of voters?
So we think it will be a basic, so if you really think, I'm not sure I understand the question, I'll just go through it quickly again. So you've got, they say there's 8 categories, you vote A in each one. If you don't care about a category, you just scratch it out, in which case it will still be the largest percentage of which you voted for, gets it. So that's approximately how that will work. So that's fine. Okay. So first, about the better democracy. So first, we think there's major social pressures in certain places to vote in a certain way. We think in many parts, for example, in Britain, there are parts of the country in which voting, for example, for the Conservative Party would be seen as a major social issue. People would look at you differently if they knew that you did. People would, you would think differently of yourself. You probably spent your whole life being told that these are the people who act in a certain way to people like you. We think that kind of identification is probably false for a lot of people. We think that often, even though, for example, someone in a certain part of the country might think, I'm a student, that means I probably want to vote for X for the party that students traditionally vote for, they might actually realise that there are policies that they haven't looked at. The problem is because there's such a social pressure to not consider those things, to not even maybe have that conversation because you're afraid of being judged by people around you for what you've done. For if you live in the north of England, it's probably difficult to go to your parents like, hey, I actually think I'm going to vote Tory, even though they've probably been telling you for a long time. Lots of people in that community have been telling you for a long time why that is a bad thing to do. So we think that the social pressure goes away at the point which you had to make a choice. We think people won't think less of you because you've had to make a rational choice to look through all of these policies and decide. We also think that, like, at that point, at least a better accountability, at the point at which we think people at the moment don't necessarily take the time to read through a manifesto. I think that's just true. People tend to go on, they don't want to, like, no thank you. They don't want to look at the manifesto, they think, yes, the Labour Party or the Social Democrats, they're the people my parents always voted for, they're the people I've normally voted for. We're not necessarily looking at the changes that have occurred in that. We think people are often, buoyed along by popularity. At the point at which you're forced to sit down and read those policies, even in the voting booth, I think it's much likely to lead you to be more informed about those policies, and more importantly, in the next election, you'll then be able to see what they've changed on. Have they actually flipped on something? Because it's much harder if they've had to write down their policies in such an easy, concise way that you've seen to then flip on that the next election without you noticing. It's harder for them to rationalise that out, and we think it's more transparent in that sense, that you can see change, and therefore you can hold them more accountable. Go.
If I want to vote for a very minor issue going to someone who says it's politics, animal rights, how will I do that?
Okay, so we think like we think that parties are okay to say, for example, we think to some extent parties will be, so the way parties will campaign, obviously, they'll send around leaflets saying, these are the things we believe about these major issues, perhaps if you like those issues, you should work out, you should think about them, and then go and vote on those separate issues. We think if they say animal rights, then you might think to yourself, okay, so animal rights is personally a huge issue for me, in that case, I am therefore going to go and vote for the party that agrees with me on their healthcare platform, but I'm going to put their vote on the healthcare platform because I believe in that. We think this problem exists on both sides, and that if you believe in an entirely minor issue which political parties don't normally engage on, your vote still isn't going to work. In this case, at least, you're able to make that choice more openly, and you know more about the other non-animal rights policies about it as well. Again, and we think, like, broadly, that animal rights person is still in trouble on both sides of the house. Okay, and then the other problem we see in society is that we think personality takes a massive leap forward in politics. We think people want to identify with groups. This is important. People want to feel belonging to this group, to a group, so they say to themselves, I am an upper-class person. Boris Johnson, for example, the mayor of London, is someone who is like me. He comes from a similar background. We probably hold similar views, but the problem is it's often like that's probably kind of counterintuitive, because just because someone comes from a similar background, it doesn't mean in any sense they actually hold policies that necessarily support the things that you want. We think people are less likely to try and take that step out, to try and be courageous and say, actually, no, I don't think that's right for me, because A, of the social pressure we told you about, and B, because they just think there's like some kind of safety in voting for people who maybe have a similar class to them or a similar race background, etc. And we think at the point, no thank you, at the point at which you've actually taken these personalities essentially out of this political system, you're much more likely to think to yourself, and you're much more likely to then, first, it reduces things like smear attacks, which we think just kind of reduce politics to like a game of personality and tittle-tattle, which isn't particularly helpful to anyone in that, no thank you, in that, because instead of being able to say, for example, X politician had an affair with X person, or, oh, what's his name, these people did this, you're instead supposed to say, look at the policies, and even if, like, okay, so you know that the party in government had some scandal, you can still look at their policies and say, right, so that person is gone, now I still have to look at the policies. It allows you to take a fresh look, a clean look, as opposed to going in there, looking at this person's face or person's name and saying, that specific person did this. You still have to take a much more kind of a different look at the political system, a kind of outside look at the political system. Okay, secondly, why it creates better politics. So first, we think it's less likely to change in government. We think what you often see in governments is that halfway through their term, they feel like it's necessary to have some kind of reshuffle. It's necessary to constantly be shuffling people out of the cabinet, out of the party, to be constantly trying to change their image. We think at this point it's much more likely that in these kind of cabinet situations with a political cabinet, you're more likely to hold on to the same people because there's no new incentive to shuffle them all out. We see, for example, what has just happened in the UK, where the Conservative government has just replaced a bunch of kind of elderly white men who used to be in the cabinet with many young women. Now, to some extent, that might be a good thing, but the other extent is mainly just a political ploy to say, look, we actually have women in the party. We think parties do the same. They say, look, we've promoted many people of ethnic minorities, even if they're not particularly representative of those ethnic minorities in their actual policies. We think this leads to that not happening at the point at which you actually get to look at their policies, and governments therefore more likely to be stable. Also, governments now governments or parties now have the necessity of actually hiring and promoting people who look like they are good at explaining policies in a concise and clear fashion. We think at the point at which you're making technocrats or people who are very good at communicating that kind of technocratic knowledge to people, that's probably more positive than people who sound good or make people think that they're from the same class or from the same background but don't necessarily have that policy background. Okay, so I've told you about why this leads to better democracy, about better political parties. Thank you very much.
Mr. speaker. 3 things for you today in opposition. First of all, we're going to talk to you about weighting, why we think this is important. Second of all, we're going to talk to you about individuated policies and how policies cannot and do not exist within a vacuum. And third of all, we're going to talk about the importance of political characters and why we think it's okay for people to vote based on the character of a particular politician. First of all, a little bit of rebuttal. What we want to say is that we like the kind of tests that people sometimes do on Facebook, where they go on and they see who their actual political decisions might match up to for a politician. What we do think, however, is that despite how enlightening these might be, we don't want people to vote on this basis solely. We think this is a problem. Okay, first thing Andrew tells you is that there's not really going to be any weighting, because you're either going to care about an issue or you're going to not care, because you either tick the box or you don't tick the box. This means that you can't weigh policies relative to each other. So you either care or you don't care about a particular issue. You cannot say, healthcare is more important to me than defence issues. We think this is problematic because it doesn't allow people to weigh policies in combination with each other. We think this is bad. Next, he tells us that it's really bad because some people vote for Labour because they see themselves as Labour. I recognise this as a problem. I had to admit to my dad the other day that I voted Labour. It was really harmful. However, voting is technically anonymous. So we think this is actually a relatively small problem, if one which exists at all. Nobody's going to be able to force you to say who you voted for. If you don't want to talk about it, you don't have to bring it up. I think that's a marginal problem. Okay, next we think it oversimplifies, he talks about how you're going to have a booklet that's going to list these policies. We think that oversimplifies political decisions. We don't think it's plausible to have all the necessary detail about a particular policy within that booklet. Because A, people, in fact, just simply, people are not going to be able to read it within that concentrated time period which you're going to give them. We don't think this is plausible. We think also it's good to be able to attach a particular politician to a particular policy, because you can then sit them down and force them to explain that policy and force them to defend it. This actually makes it unclear when Andrew talks about how he wants technocrats who are going to be able to discuss these policies. It's unclear why they want that, because how are you going to be able to sit down a particular person and say, explain this policy to me and to defend this policy, because you can't match policies to particular political parties. So we think that's problematic in itself. Last thing he tells you about is about media smear campaigns. Okay, first of all, we think it's fine to want to judge the moral character of a politician who's going to represent you in government. More on that later. But secondly, we think it's legit for people to get the truth, and sometimes media smear campaigns do this. Okay, first thing we bring you today in opposition is about weighting. So as I already hinted at, we think it's important that under, as in status quo, you can decide which policies are most important to you relative to other policies. Because what we get is a combination of policies from a particular political party. These policies are not in isolation. So you can say that I am willing to support X in order to get Y, because Y is more important to me. Okay, now you don't get this. Now what you get is, when you vote for X, you're also complicitly giving your consent to voting for Y, but you don't know that because you don't know that all of those policies exist as a combination. You don't know how they fit together. We think this is problematic. This is related to the weighting problem, because people can't necessarily say, well, this is more important to me, so if it comes down to it, I'd rather you took my vote on this basis rather than taking it on this basis and giving it to that party. So we think that's a problem. Related to this, we think that individuated policies are problematic in and of themselves. Policies don't exist within a vacuum. So, for example, you might agree with a particular restriction on the welfare state, but you might not agree with it in combination with another restriction or another form of austerity. This doesn't allow you to vote based on a complete picture, and we think this is problematic in and of itself, because you don't know how these policies are going to play out in reality. So we think it's not more representative and it's not more accurate in representing your interests, because you're voting on one thing in isolation. You don't know how that plays out in reality. Next, and perhaps the most important thing we're going to bring you, is political characters, and why it's okay to be able to vote based on, at least in part, the character of the politician that you're voting for. Okay, because we think it's important that, first of all, voters have trust in the moral values that the politicians they vote for expound, because these people are going to represent them in government. Okay, the policy that the proposition present us with is a de facto ban on this. Okay, because you can't attach your vote to a particular politician who you respect for X reason and who you would like to represent you in government. We think there are two major problems with this. First of all, a simple time issue, okay? If you vote for someone in 2014, you don't know what's going to happen in 2016 that they might have to vote on in government, and you don't know what way they're going to vote, because you can't judge them, because you don't know anything about their character or their personality, or how they've voted in the past. You have no way of assessing that, because you don't know what policy you're attaching your vote to represents which politician in your constituency. So we think that's a problem. You don't know what's going to happen in the future. I'll take you in a second. Secondly, we think it's a problem for executive decisions which are taken without direct input from a manifesto that governments have been elected on the basis of. So these politicians also represent you on like an international stage. They take executive decisions, for example, to go to war, to defend certain countries. You don't know what's going to happen in the future. You can't vote based on that. I'll take your PY.
So a politician which you were elected through this process is probably more agreed on most policies you voted for. So therefore, this politician has probably the same moral framework because he came to the conclusion that those policies are the best. Isn't this like solving the problem, future problems?
Okay, not necessarily, because you are voting like on one particular issue and your vote goes to one particular party, but you have no way of like knowing which way that party might vote on a completely different policy. So if you like healthcare type X and you vote for healthcare type X, but you don't like defence policy Y, but you've now given your like consent to defence policy Y by extension, you have no way of knowing that. And the two like moral frameworks would be entirely different. There's no way of knowing like what those are going to be. This is particularly problematic given that like no government and no political party comes to an election with a manifesto which is explicit in like every way. It like excludes future issues and also like non-explicit decisions of the kind which executives often take. So this is problematic because the only way to control this is to allow the electorate to vote on particular politicians. It's particularly problematic because the effects of the policies they vote on cannot be undone. So having a restriction on welfare that you did not know you were voting for and which you like complicitly voted for has effects on people which cannot simply undone. So you can't know if X will launch an illegal war or if X is going to take away like some particular like welfare benefit or something like that. You don't know that when you vote for them. You can't tell properly as to how this person has behaved in the past and the kind of like principles they usually expound. You have no way of voting on that. So, Mr. Speaker, because we think it's important to weigh things relative to each other, because we think that policies don't exist in a vacuum and rather are a combination of policies which work together in reality, and because we think it's good and fair that voters should know who they're voting for, we beg you to oppose.
Carrying the case, A, government team about to work on.
So, can you obviously talk a little bit about that? Mr. Speaker, the two biggest problems facing modern democracy today is basically a crisis of participation and meaningful representation, and secondly, a boring policy discussion that lacks dynamism, new ideas, and justification. Two things. Firstly, given that representation and participation, and secondly, I'm going to look at and tell you why policy is bad now and how our policy makes it better. Firstly, though, quite a lot of rebuttal. A clarification: if you have one really small issue that you care about, like animal rights, that probably wouldn't be represented by major political parties anyway. Now, moreover, perhaps you could have a small political party just having like one thing on a ballot box. Loads of rebuttal to Sarah. Firstly, how are voters going to know and have a time period to decide what they want? Well, presumably that's just the same like in a normal political electoral system that exists now, that you have a cycle, 6 months of discussion and debate. Secondly, how do we call people to account and have people defending policies? Well, like, the parties still campaign on the policies, right? So you would still have a left-wing party campaigning on broadly left-wing policies. The point is now, when you go to the ballot box, you don't just tick the party's name, you tick individually the policies that they campaign for and see if you're persuaded by them, right? And then when you have someone elected, they're still going to be accountable to that policy because that's the one you picked. No. Then he said, well, it's very important for policies don't exist in a vacuum, right? You need to have a complete picture of what you're voting for. A few responses. Sure, so voters don't generally exist in a vacuum, right? So it's quite likely that your preferences are going to be aligned anyway. But moreover, even if it's not, you go for the one that's most important. You go for the one that's most important to you, right? So if healthcare is the most important, and you know that you may have conflicting political ideologies, you go for that one, right? Moreover, so stuff doesn't exist in a complete picture. That's fine. On character and personality cults, Like, firstly, we're still okay to some extent to have personalities campaigning for a specific issue. Just now you can't attach one face to a whole political party. You attach it to one thing that they're campaigning for. So that's a good thing. And then I had one other point of rebuttal. Do you know what you're voting for? Well, yeah, because presumably you're told the political party you voted for after, and you still have like a constituency representative, right? So you're still able to like hold them to account. So you do know these things, right? Constructive. No thanks. I'd rather do my first point. Right, so why you have better representation and participation. Right, firstly, Andrew tells you a lot of things that goes unresponded to completely about how people now aren't truly represented, right? How you just like don't think about the policies you're voting for, and you vote based on tradition, what your family like want you to vote for. Also, there's a lot of social pressure in the north of England, for example, you'll be condemned if you vote for a specific political party, right? Moreover, we say personality can warp this. But most importantly, when you're not thinking about policies and just political parties, you're completely sort of like turned off immediately when you see a face from another political party. You're just like, oh, they're speaking, I'm not going to listen to them because they're from party X that I don't like. Now we break that down and make people actually think what they're saying because that's what they're going to be voting on. That's more meaningfully like representative. No thanks. Right. So also, we think we break down the problem of safe seats, right? Like, it's just true in a lot of first-past-the-post systems that people's votes do not matter. What's the problem here? Firstly, because people's votes do not matter, they don't bother voting in the first place. But secondly, often safe seats are safe seats because people just don't think and they vote blindly upon tradition. When we make them vote upon policy, you can have a marginal increase on people now meaningfully represented within safe seats. Also, we think our policy makes politicians more accountable. Why do we think that? Because now, someone like people know exactly the policies and take attention to what political parties have been elected for. And if they don't deliver on that, you're more able to hold them to account. And because we have more of a discussion of more policies. So we think that's quite a good thing. Clayton.
Okay, given that you still allow those parties to hand out flyers and to promote their exact policies, why won't figureheads still be in the media just telling you which 8 boxes to tick and then still allow you to vote on that same tradition?
Yeah.
How's any of that going to change?
Yeah, because now, right, we have a discussion about those policies and those policies will be challenged. It's far easier when you don't have to speak explicitly about policies for that figurehead to have more influence. But when you're stuck at the ballot box looking at 2 competing ideologies or ideas about how we solve a problem, you're forced to think, right? You don't have, you have to evaluate it, or at least it's marginally better. And then also on the representation, we make people think a bit more about care about issues, right? Because specifically they're being asked to vote on healthcare, they might go and do their own investigation into healthcare policies and why maybe not they work. Right? Why we get more dynamic policy discussion? Well, people are voting on that. Importantly, though, we change the way that politics works. We change the way that political discourse happens. Like, what kind of things are we talking about? We're an end to smear campaigns on specific individuals that don't really affect what happens. They're just an easy sort of political win. Moreover, we get this rid of negative campaigning, right? Which is quite it's very sexy and it sells to say another party mucked up. It doesn't really offer anything substantive, right? If you give a negative case, you'll never win a debate, right? Importantly now, because parties are being elected on specific policies, they are going to talk about their affirmative case and actual things they're going to do to make the world a better place. Also, we think there's a general problem because parties are so traditionally voted for. They're never forced to justify their core beliefs, right? It's just true that obvious political discussion that should happen is never spoken about. So what we get is exactly the kind of thing that Andrew's spoken about, a better political environment that's conducive to discussion and debate, and where policies can't be hid behind because of your party, but you actually need them to be defended. In that sense, then, we think we get better political decisions being made and a more engaged, representative electorate. Proudly, I propose. Speaker, Ollie's obviously right. The crisis of representation and accountability is important. The problem is that this policy does not solve it and, in fact, exacerbates it. 3 things. 1, this policy won't work, like it actually won't work and achieve any of their benefits. But then, assuming that it could do so, it would actually make the government less representative, and it would lead to the system actually misaligning voters' preferences with outcomes greater than would currently happen. Before that, 4 points of rebuttal. Firstly, Ollie says that people vote on tradition, familial expectation, and what have you. Certainly that is a variable, but it is not the only variable. Policies do matter, okay? The reason the Tories are culturally unpopular in the north of England is not because people one day decided they hated posh people, but because the Tories implemented significantly damaging economic policies to those regions and have continued to do so since then, right? Just like they were very, very right-wing and made lots of poor people poorer. So, like, that's why they're unpopular. It's not just because we hate posh people. Then he says, oh, Peter will be turned off because they'll see one person who's from another party advocating for policy. But he still want to have people, these are parties, advocating for policies under his model. So that is still going to be the case, but the voting system has changed. Then he says, first past the post is really bad. Yes, so that's maybe an argument for AV, not an argument for this particular voting system, way of allocating the votes rather than how those votes are weighed in the election. And then he says you get policy challenge, which otherwise doesn't happen because people are like in awe of their leaders. As a Labour Party member, I can tell you that our leader has certainly not gone unchallenged, despite the fact that many people like him on the basis of his policies. But also, it doesn't create the political theory discussion that Ollie wants, right? Even if you do get policy challenge, because when people are asking should the top rate of tax be at 40% or 50%. No one's arguing, well, is having a government and a tax legitimate per se, because we've already reached that question at the point at which we're talking about policies. So the questions you want answered have already been answered by the time you're talking about policy. Why the opening of prop just won't work? Because what they said is you can identify all the policies that matter, and then those will be weighted. So presumably, as a Labour Party voter, I just need to be able to memorise Labour's transport policy, say everything else is completely unimportant to me, and vote on that basis. And I have exactly the same votes that I do now. Recognise that if Ollie's problem is tribalism, all the people he thinks are tribal will do that, because they don't want the other party to be the recipients of their votes. No, thank you, Ollie. Note that also, all the political party leaderships he says are bad have an incentive to encourage their voters to do exactly that, right? Specifically, when there are significant policy divides between them, for instance, between the current Conservative and Labour parties within the United Kingdom, or between the Republicans and the Democrats in the USA, they can say, if you want to stop this person, this is our policy on this issue, pick this and only this, and your vote will count 100% for us, and there is no risk of anybody else voting for it. Why is that bad? Because it means that people are significantly less informed, right? Because they vote solely on the basis of one policy. Under our side, they at least read, understand, and potentially weight other policies which then inform their vote, right? But the point at which you're saying one policy is enough, you actually get less representation under your side, not under ours. So, presuming that closing government can provide a mechanism that actually works in this debate, why that would be bad? One, the governments are less representative. Firstly, recognise that this kind of weighting of multiple policies will take time. Large numbers of people currently don't vote because they are either too busy or can't be bothered. At the point at which voting takes significantly longer because you have to read through a book of policies and weight them all, we think turnout is likely to go down quite significantly. One, because people just can't take off the 90 minutes they need to go to the voting booth, currently it takes about 5, but also because they just can't be bothered. Reading policies is boring, there are much better things to do. Likelihood then, you have a less representative government which is elected on a smaller electorate, and therefore the representation problem gets worse. No, but also you have a problem of policy simplicity, right? Because not only does it take time to read and people won't do that, but that you need information to assess that policy, right? Large amounts of what a policy constitutes is not specified within the manifesto. It is determined by the implementation that is undertaken by the executive. Not good for you, Ollie. Because what that means is, in the manifesto, the thing you're voting on never contains the full detail of what will actually be implemented. It has the initial idea of what a policy might be, which you then claim is the end result. Why is that really problematic? Because it means that you can't assess policies, right? For instance, like very far-right parties in the UK say, we'll just stop all immigration now. And that's a very simple policy to understand, okay? And also very easy to understand why that might be a good thing for you. The problem is, you can't understand what the implications of that policy would be, or why alternative policies, like restrictions but not cutting off immigration completely, would be preferable because of the impacts of the UKIP policy or the very far-right policy would have on other policy areas. That means that the point at which parties have incentives to do that, so people read their policy, understand it, and vote for it under their system, you actually have a less good understanding of what policies are being implemented per se. That's entirely bad. Yeah, go on then.
Well, presumably then have to go and explain them to try and persuade them that their policy is better, at which point they may elaborate between those simple lines that you go and tick. and you have like a more better understanding.
Yeah, the problem is, Ollie, that would then, once you've listened to the UKIP party spokesman explain what their policy is, that would seem to undermine the idea that voting for UKIP's policy is anonymous, right? And you can't work out who UKIP are and who anyone else is on the test, right? Unfortunately, explaining your policies defeats your own policy. Right, so the system leads to the election results which are less aligned. The first reason for this is weighting accuracy, right? Because policies do not exist individually. They are sets, right? And you can't weigh things solely on the basis of that policy alone. Currently, the thing that they're basing their policy off, which is basically vote for policies, says pick a number out of thin air and say that's how much you care about this issue. The problem is you can't know how accurate that number is, really, because you've no frame of reference what is innate in this context. The problem, then, is you can only say how important an issue is to you when you know what choosing that issue means qua choosing any other issues that are on the ballot, right? So you need to be able to say, healthcare is really important to me, but because the healthcare policy I like is coming within a manifesto of a party who will do lots of other things I don't like, healthcare is relatively less important to me than all of those other things. Why is it bad that we have this policy for that end? Because people have an ability to take in the information and weigh that policy. What you get on their side when random numbers are allocated before the vote and you don't know how those policies are grouped so you can't assess the trade-offs properly, you increase the likelihood of inaccurate results happening, i.e. somebody saying, I really liked that healthcare policy, but I didn't realise it was the Conservatives and I'd much rather I'd not voted for that and voted for other things. So actually you get less accurate election results on their side of the House, and that's an incredibly bad thing. Other reasons this happens. Firstly, variables are excluded, as Sarah says and we hear no response to. The only way you have to know how people are going to make executive decisions down the line or before the next election is on the basis of their character and their trustworthiness. At the point at which that variable is excluded, your ability to select a government you think will actually deliver the policies that you want is seriously undermined. Recognise that's the only way that can happen under us, and it happens on our side of the House, not on theirs. Or lastly, single issue voters. On our side, they at least have some expression on other policies that go along with their party. On their side, it is only that policy and only that one. Prop need to provide a viable model for this, but even if they could, it'd be a bad idea. So please oppose.
I would like to thank James for his speech, and now I'd like to call upon Leonard to open the case for the Tilbury House.
Mr. Speaker, the way to value a political system, or an electoral system rather, is to measure which election system is better catered at distracting the preferences of voter within a system. So that is the crucial question of this debate. Does a blind voting system actually lead to better representation of the preferences and the diverse preferences of voters within that system? This is why I firstly look at how blind voting actually changes the incentives for existing parties to cater to the preferences, the diverse preferences of voters. And secondly, I'm going to talk about the barriers for new parties and new ideas to enter the marketplace of ideas and how this actually makes that situation better. First of all, some point of rebuttal. It was claimed that this policy doesn't work because, it's too simplistic, you can't weigh different options. Mind, Mr. Speaker, that in the status quo, you only have one vote. In this policy, you can actually have more nuance because the process now becomes more nuanced. Because you can you can say that you care more about this that your preferences in one particular policy issue refers to one party, whereas another policy you might have vote on a different issue. That the way that it is beneficial is that irrespective of non-policy related issues, this actually makes the process more nuanced. Why is that better, or why would that work? Because it exposes the voter, it forces the voter not only to tick one box in the sense of which party, but actually to have exposure to different kinds of issues and to really deal with the fact of how I stand on these different issues. That in itself as a process makes the process of voting more nuanced and therefore makes it better. Let's look firstly at the idea of incentives for existing parties. I think a big problem within many electoral systems is the fact that single issues overshadow the real preferences of voters. What you see in the US, for example, is the religious right who
fosters the idea of religion as the most important issue to that people should vote on. This is encouraged by the media like Fox News, who encourage that topic to be the only one that matters. Why is that a problem? It is a problem because people who go into the narrative of that is the most important issue, then tend to vote Republican. The problem with that is that is not always the best option for them in a sense of really reflecting their preferences. Why? Because Republicans, for example, have a policy of tax cuts for the super rich, which clearly violates the preferences of people who are religious but are poorer. How does this policy change it? The question that we want to bring forward is like, it is true that voters in that system can still only vote for the policy option or like the topic of religion, for example, how they stand on abortion, only tick that box and leave the other one blank. But we don't think they will. Why? Because it's not the fact that, for example, someone who in the status quo votes Republican doesn't care at all about tax policy or anything. He just thinks that this one issue overshadows the other. What we are doing with that policy is forcing that voter to have a more nuanced approach to the voting process. No, thank you. Why is that good? Well, it's good because it's like the weighing of importance of different issues is actually more nuanced under our approach. Because if I now realize, due to the fact that I have to engage, or that I'm now actually asked on how I stand on tax policy, for example, then I can simply tag that I don't believe in tax cuts for the super rich. And if the outcome of these different preferences, that in the end the vote goes to the Democrats, that is in effect better for my preferences, because that is actually what the outcome of a more nuanced approach is compared to a situation where I only have one choice and then let issues like religion overshadow my real preferences. Closing.
Who determines which subjects are selected for this test?
Well, first of all, that's a policy question that should have been answered by the opening. But anyway, but still, like I think, like in broad, you can look at party programs, for example, which deal with a lot of the variety of issues. Opening said that there are like 8 or 10 issues which I deal with, and these are usually the topics that party programs deal with. So I think it would be reasonable to assume that those are the issues that will come up in that speech, in that voting system. Okay, let's look secondly into the. So, in essence, this the incentive for existing parties would be to, if their policy in the status quo only meet some preferences of their voters, but not all, they now have an incentive, because the system is more nuanced, to actually change their policy in a sense to better cater the interest of voters. Let's look secondly into the idea of market barriers or barriers to the existence of new ideas and better solutions within the political process. We acknowledge that in the status quo, if someone comes up with a new party or a new idea that isn't brought into an established party, it is very hard for that person to be elected. Why? Because no one knows it. Even if he has the best solution within the marketplace of ideas, it is the barrier to actually enter a new party or enter a new idea outside of an existing party is very hard. We think that is hugely problematic. Why is that? Because it gives a lot of power to existing parties, right? It's very few individuals who make policy within parties. It's also for interest groups, it's much easier to convince someone in an existing party. Like if there's a two-party system, I only need to convince the few individuals who make policy on a certain issue and convince them whether it's with campaign contributions or other kinds of influence making. We think that is hugely problematic because it gives power to very few individuals, rather than having a competition in a sense of a competition, what is the best solution? What do voters think is the best solution, right? Our system offers the voter a more nuanced approach in a sense that they can really evaluate on what solutions in what particular subject is beneficial for them. We think that hugely influences new parties of how they can arise, how they can offer new solutions. That is particularly better compared to when they offer them into the established parties because of lobbyists. Also because, like, in existing parties, there's an establishment of people who don't like to be challenged by new people coming in. They want their own tickets. They want their government post, and therefore they have an incentive in the status quo not to let in new people or new ideas that challenge the way that they have always done politics. In essence, what we brought to you in closing up is, first of all, that the status quo, or this policy actually incentivizes political parties to actually better cater to the preferences of their voters. And secondly, it hugely decreases the barriers there is for new ideas, better solutions that are in accordance with the preferences of voters to arise. And therefore we say blind voting is a way to go.
Mr. Speaker, the state has an enormous effect upon all of our lives. It can make it better, it can make it so much worse. But importantly, the state has a different effect on each individual's life. It has a different effect on a person who has a coal plant built nearby, who is impoverished, who really cares about animal rights. Well, we think, therefore, that when we hold the state to account, we think that the state should make it possible for every voter to make as much information possible about this individual's unique circumstances in order to most effectively sway the state's policy. But the fact that they leave out enormous amount of information by just referring this to 8 to 10 subjects you may want to discuss, we think that is incredibly damaging to the legitimacy of government. What are we going to talk about in second opposition? Firstly, we're going to give you a positive defence of why we could value personality as over policy pamphlets. Secondly, why we think single and regional issues are skewed out and why it is massively damaging considering the personal is political. Thirdly, why we think this hurts policy making and accountability in general, creating more incentive to go towards common places, no longer testing past performances, etc. And finally, why this will scare large swathes of voters away and why this is massively damaging. Before I do that, I have one point of rebuttal to the government bench. The government bench presumes, in its conceptual framing, that people now vote based on the Tories or Labour, based on the idea that they are incredible ideological things, people I care about, people I think of unquestionably. If that is the real irrational, according to them, big thing I care about, I will switch off as soon as I hear anyone else talk about policy. That means I will inevitably only listen to their policies and think, I'll vote for that reason. I can just bring a scratch card with me which sets the policies on that. That means that the only benefit the opening government can claim is people have read for 2 minutes on a policy pamphlet on someone they were going to vote on regardless anyway, because they already believe in familiar values and therefore they're not interested in listening to the other things. So in that conception, we're unsure why 2 minutes of reading things is more important than all the things we're going to talk to you about. So, a positive defence of personality. Recognise, no thank you, that it's more important if a policy gets enacted than which policy ideas are there. Because how a policy gets enacted is actually the thing that determines and has influence upon your life and therefore is more meaningful to you. We say in that regard, a personality is far more important than which exact policies they seem to pursue. Why is that? A couple of reasons. Firstly, opening opposition has already explained to you that that there could be in the future different policy, different outcome based on differential situations, and therefore you need to question back to that person and question their ideological values, because they can't predict the crisis beforehand. What we add to that is that we think a personality is then important in determining whether this person can get policies enacted, whether they gel well together with other forms of fields. If we know, for instance, that Gordon Brown was massively derised by large parts of the Labour government, we wouldn't have voted maybe for Labour. We would have maybe voted for another leftist party or maybe for another MP within that, because we understood he would be incapable of effectively formulating and actuating policy, but also getting members across. We think that's far more important. We think that's especially important, for instance, on the forms of international relations, where we see often it's far more of a personality killed, given there's less policy discussions and more agreements and pressure on that. So we recognise, for instance, Tony Blair was highly successful in forming a bond with the US government. Those are things we can no longer talk about because those aren't things that are saturated in policy. There's a massive effect on the relations with one of your biggest economic trading partner and therefore the getting of jobs, and it's therefore an incredibly meaningful difference to have. We tell you in that way that personality is highly important. It's also important in terms of legacy building. There's an elected leader who can make you feel enfranchised about voting, who can move people to the voting box, because you may not want to only get your preference out. You want other people to share your preference and share your view, and you want people to be convinced by that, and that's your proxy man for doing so. We think all of that's far more important than just you as an individual voting a policy, because it has far more influence on whether a policy gets meaningfully enacted and where therefore your life will change. But more than that, we think the skews have single and regional issues. Why is that? Because only 8 to 10 things are determined. They're probably also determined by politically neutral, or other words, establishment committees. What does that mean? That new policies really don't get out. Something closing government wanted, we don't think really will happen, because the new ideas and new elements are the things that they don't have an advantage on. So it's more difficult for newer parties with newer revolutionary topics, or topics that aren't currently being talked about, like poverty in a sense in many countries around the world, to actually get that in, because that's no longer what they can be voted upon. They tell you, no, it's something that animal rights or something a party will always talk about. But in this policy, This, like, you will not be voted upon in animal rights, so political parties don't have any incentive to focus on animal rights in any sense. No, thank you. And you can't get them to towards that. We recognise in the Netherlands, the Green Party, when they moved away from animal rights to focus towards being more of a green economic party, the Animal Party stepped in, focusing solely on that issue, which wasn't really on the table before, and forced the entirety of the left to take it more seriously to recapture 5 or 6 seats in that. So in that way, we think it's massively important. Similarly, in regional issues, because it will be probably like on a it's done in first past the post. Regional issues can be massively important. You get your local MP to talk about the local coal plant. That doesn't happen on their life, but we think that so much more meaningfully affects your life than some economic term in 1 to 5%. Where it's about your direct life, your direct health, your access to a highway. All that's so much more important, and it's never discussed about on their side of the house, even though it's more meaningfully enacted in your life. So we think that's bad. But moreover that, we think it actually hurts policy making. Before I do that opening.
If you really care about a regional issue that isn't on one of the questions, what are you going to do? You're probably going to speak to people within the major political parties first to find out their lines, and then go and go for the question to make sure that the party you want is in, who's then going to affect the decision that you want.
The thing is that I may want to disagree with these people on other forums. If I have to, but also, I may not want to influence and think about all these other policies. I just want to have the person who says, I vote for that policy. But more than that, it might be difficult for me to understand which kind, on which person I vote, because there's uncertainty whether if I vote on certain policy boxes, if I get the right person out. So all of that becomes more difficult in that. But finally, policy making becomes more distracted. Why is that? Firstly, we think it goes far more towards common places, easier policies that people are more likely to vote towards, because now they're voting explicitly based on policies, so they want things that are more attractive to a larger voter base. So more controversial policies are therefore less likely to get weighted within that, because you can't carry them on the performance of a proportionality at all. We also don't think that you can test on past performance. You can't ask, has a policy been acted in the past space, because you're only voting on future policy in that, so that no longer becomes a part of the political process. On scaring away large parts of voters. This is difficult. This is really, really difficult for a large part of voters who want to vote for ideological reasons. They have to go towards a policy platform if they want to have the in-depth discussion the government wants. On that premise, that means a large amount of people will not take the effort and time to vote. That is massively damaging, because their vote still matters, even if it may not have been articulated as explicitly correctly as people in this debate have done. It is important to get these people out, certainly because that implies the incentive for movements to go towards them. We definitely think the state should never enfranchise them and create a simple voting system for them to get to have their say, even if they don't have the capacity to do so under their system. For all these reasons we oppose.
Okay, my partner previously talked about how taking out emotion leads to a better political process and how it leads to new parties being established doing policies which we actually want. So I'm going to talk about how the political process works, especially on focusing on emotions. And second of all, I'm going to talk about those new parties. But first of all, a couple points of rebuttal. Okay. So what we say, first of all, the opening up has had a problem. Those policies now, policies don't single it by itself, so they have to see the complete package, right? But notice specifically, that's currently under the status quo, that's the same problem, right? Because I vote for a party compromise, right? So they also I don't tell my party. So usually parties have a lot of policies they want to implement, and they only do this in a political process, and most party systems we're talking about have to form coalitions, so have to compromise. So I don't even have an incentive here as well. The advantage here is I can actually say this policy is important to me, and can make parties making it more clear that should be where the minority stands on, because the parties see obviously, okay, most people wanted to implement this policy, right? So they actually have an incentive to look way closer on which policies should be implemented, right? Then they say, okay, then this came this idea on the regional issue is going to be very neglected now. They're saying of course, regional issues are very important for people who are like voting there and it affects them. But I don't see how this contradicts our model, because obviously if we won't ask the community council on their opinion on Syria, right? We're going to ask them questions which are relevant for their election, right? So, and if so that's still not contradictory to the model we present here in principle, right? And then they said, okay, what's about things that are on the political agenda but don't fit those categories? Like we say, like obviously it's gonna be a process where like agendas are set in public, right? And then therefore they are on this policy, and so people can vote on. So I don't see the problem here. How like topics can be on the agenda if people care about, they're obviously going to be asked on this. So I think this is a minor, and it's not principal reason why to neglect this policy. And then okay, why is this so? Why is emotion is so strongly used here in politics currently, and why we think it's good to like take that out more out of the process, right? Okay. First of all, like people's time is very restricted. So like you work, you do some stuff. So you cannot like always read the complete newspaper and really figure out what the party is actually doing and what they actually stand for. You cannot read their manifest, and you cannot like sufficiently follow the political process to say like, okay, this party has actually really done what they said, right? And parties know this. No, thank you. But people usually, what's the difference here? Like people actually really know like what they want, right? If they want healthcare or if they don't want healthcare, that's a pretty straightforward question for them. Okay, so existing parties know this, and so they especially appeal on the emotion of the voter, right? How do they do this? They usually try to present themselves in a positive light, like making great pictures and all this stuff, and especially also parties using like negative images, creating a negative emotions about other people. For example, we've seen as Obama tried to implement healthcare system, the Republicans run a huge campaign how the government is raping you at the doctor's office. No, thank you. We say like this is actually not possible, because like if the party, like a Republican party, would run with this strong emotions, there will never be a policy option that says like, do you want to get raped by the government? It's never going to happen, right? So the emotions here is completely taken out. So okay, so why I think that it's good here to take this out, right? So people vote for somebody because they believe this one is going to be greatly representing me as opening up, like I trust this person because I just love how they look, I think how they speak greatly, right? We think that's especially actually bad, because usually what's so specific about emotion? So we've voted somebody on this, and we think like, okay, now this guy, like I have a strongly emotional connection, that's very hard to challenge for me. A policy is way more like nuanced. I can say like, okay, I agree with this policy, I don't agree with this policy, but if I build up an emotional opinion or think a connection to somebody, I think it's very harder to challenge for a voter to see that they was wrong. Second of all, like parties should be judged on the policy, right? And that's not happening under the current system, because like already stated, right? The Republican campaign on the healthcare system was extremely exaggerated. They built up stuff that is never going to happen, and which was never actually the policy of the Democratic Party, right? So if they have voted on like in the segment healthcare, what do we want? Then usually even people probably would agree to the Democratic proposal, even so they probably start doing to the ad campaign, which focused on one policy proposal, would have done this on this closing.
Why is it illegitimate to vote on the basis of personality?
No, we don't say that it's illegitimate. We just say it's a way better system we're creating now, right? Because first of all, we think we think that's so. Like I said, so we're more likely to challenge you to people who have done stuff. You're more likely to actually count parties accountable on what they did. Next one, next one. What my partner talked about, like some people just don't see, look at at parties as a whole, and that's what we're forcing that now. So we say like you actually have to consider, if you vote for a party, you have to see it's actually aspect of your life. So you don't make systematic choices against yourself. And we say like in this policy, we actually do this because it's impossible for parties to say like one thing that we do for you, but on the other hand do a lot of stuff against you, because now you have to consider everything. Next one, why is this like so? How does this creating emotion prevents new parties from entering the game, right? Because actually creating emotion is very expensive for parties, and you need a lot of leverage here, right? You need money to make advertisement. You need media attention to come into here, to be interviewed, to come on television shows. And we say that this is actually
more likely to keep new parties out, right? Because now a new party can now be established, even so if there's like, they don't need this leverage. So it's much more easier they don't need this money, they don't need these institutions, they don't have to be like established partner being interviewed in a television show. They can just come up with new ideas, and if they match enough policies, they come in here, right? And why is this extremely better? That's for several reasons. First of all, like we say, like we see like societies being more and more diverse, so they have more and more interest. We say like people who have no parties which represent are more likely to engage here and come in and then come into policies. And generally, I say it gives, like my partner said, a more nuanced politics, which is very important because people have more and more nuanced views on different topics, and therefore we're back here to propose.
Mr. Speaker, I think I would have lived in a horrendous country if Geert Wilders from the Freedom Party would have at least double the amount of votes as he has in the status quo. That is exactly what this policy is going to create. We think that those kind of populist policies and populist parties should not be voted into government. We think that we should assess people on the nuance of their policies, something we can't do if we just ask them, do you like tax benefits or not? We think that that is what those voting boxes in those in your ballot box are going to be about. We don't think that's going to be more nuanced. We don't think it's going to be more representative. We think it's going to skew the vote. It's going to limit the amount of accountability politicians have. It's going to limit the amount of accountability and the influence smaller parties have. We also think it's going to limit the amount of new interest and new ideas being brought forward within politics. I'm going to talk about broadly two things. First of all, I'm going to talk some clarifications on why we think that if they want to have completely blind voting, that was not what they were propping. If they don't want completely blind voting, then they're basically propping the status quo and they're not making any change. Secondly, I'm going to talk about why we have less representation on three levels. First, one point of rebuttal. On the issue of regional issues, they say two things. The first thing they tell you is, yeah, but you can still talk to your local MP and then tell him that you think regional issues are really important, so he can push that forward, which was in a POI by opening government. Don't think that's true, right? Because if your issue is we don't want public figureheads on TV, we don't want people canvassing and showing how great of a personality you are, you can't go to them because you don't know who to approach. You don't know whether you can trust them into listening to you because you've never had the ability to engage with them, given that they don't want you to do it, because apparently engaging with politicians is awful and harmful because they all tell lies and they're only public figureheads. Then second half tells you, yeah, but obviously your local council is not going to talk about Syria. So if you want to talk about local issues, you should do that into local council. We think many local issues are important in national politics as well, and that is why those issues are crowded out. That's something that neither of the proposition teams engaged with. Okay, some clarifications. In my first POI during the opening government speech, I already pointed out that if they're still going to allow people to print out flyers which tells you tick box 5 and 6 on this question and then we will win, there's not going to be any change because you're going to still have the same figureheads fighting into the media to get your vote, telling exactly what to do. That's not blind voting, so that's not going to change anything. If they truly want to change anything and therefore are going to effectively do blind voting, that means it's going to be a lot harder for political parties to have election campaigns in which they focus on explaining what their policies are going to do. Because when you do so, you're no longer blind voting because people already know that that policy belongs to that party. We think that is massively harmful because that means that voters are less informed of the effect that certain policies might have. That means that we're not having a more nuanced vote. It means we're going to have a less nuanced vote because I no longer know what my vote means. I no longer know that if I vote for, an increase in tax, I do that because then on the other spectrum, it might help increasing benefits for the poor. That is something we can't explain and link to each other anymore because we vote on those issues separately. That's not more nuanced, that's less nuanced. And only saying it's more nuanced doesn't make it more nuanced. Probably closing government should have explained that a little bit better. Okay, lack of representation. First of all, we think that policies policies will become more populist and will crowd out single issues and regional issues. Why will policies become more populist? All political parties, regardless of in which political system we have an interest in getting the highest and greatest amount of votes ever. That means that if you vote for only policies on your ballot, that means that they're very likely to say things that we all genuinely like. We all genuinely probably like better healthcare, tax cuts, nice education. These are the things that they will be discussing. These are the exact same things that Geert Wilders is really good at discussing. That means that he will not say, I'm going to kick out all Moroccans. He will probably say, we're going to decrease crime rates. That's probably something the majority of people in a country like. That means that we're going to vote on very non-specific grounds, but that also means that the accountability on more specific issues is no longer there, right? Because if Parliament now discusses, for example, euthanasia or abortion, I no longer know what the party stance on that topic is. So I also can't hold them accountable, right? Because if I go to the ballot box again in 4 years, they still won't ask me questions on what do I think of euthanasia. They still don't ask me questions on what do I think on animal rights. Yet that will still be discussed in politics. That means that on all other issues than the 9 issues I'm voting on in the ballot box, politicians will not be accountable for, because I can't tell them I didn't want them to do that. I can't tell them I think other things are more important. But it also means that those single issues will be less represented, because I can't say I think that animal rights are more important than other rights. I can't say I think it is more important to have a female representing me than a male. We think it is going to lead to less minority representation due to the fact that many, especially conservative parties, still have loads of their male people high up on their ballot rather than females. We think that that is also representation. We don't think representation is just on policy basis. We think personality is hugely important. Personality creates trust, which is useful on the timeline, because we need the trust to also trust them in doing the good things for us in 3 or 2 years time. We also think that many policies are enacted on the basis of personality. When Dan explains to you why, especially within international relations, having a very strong personality enacting your policy is a benefit. All of those things you won't have, because you have absolutely no say on what kind of persons you will have representing that party. We think that is massively problematic for the representation and how a representative or government is. We also think that, lastly, that this is going to make voters stay away. Opening opposition explained to you that people just don't want to spend more time than 5 seconds in that ballot box ticking a vote. Dan added to that, explaining why especially certain people who have difficulty engaging with often complicated policies now feel less engaged because they no longer understand what politics is about. You make that worse when you limit the amount of canvassing people can do and limit the amount of explanation they can get. That means that we're going to lose out on a lot of votes from the lower socioeconomic classes. We think that those people deserve to be represented as well. That's something you guys didn't engage with and didn't deal with. Mr. Speaker, because we think that every single individual in a country needs to be represented, because we also think that policy should be enacted the best way as possible. We're very proud to oppose this motion.